Would you eat this crab? How about this one? Crabs aren't usually the prettiest food, but this genus of crab seems to be particularly unappealing. These are called Heike crabs, or Heikegani, and while apparently edible, they're not typically eaten. Why is that? Legend attributes this to the grooves on the back of their carapaces, which you may have already noticed look like something a little bit more familiar than a crab's back. The legend is based on the Japanese water battle of Dan no Ura, which happened here in southwestern Japan in the spring of 1185. During this battle, the Taira clan was defeated, extinguishing their dominance and drowning the 7-year-old emperor of Japan, Emperor Entoku. Also drowned were nearly all of the Heike warriors. All of that is true. The part that is legend states that these warriors were reincarnated as Heike crabs, with their faces, more specifically their samurai scowls, imprinted on their carapaces. In the 20th century, a more plausible explanation for these markings emerged. As Japanese fishermen caught these crabs, it's suggested that they threw back the ones which bore these faces. The stronger the crab's resemblance to a face, the more likely the fishermen were to be repulsed, and the more likely they were to throw the crab back. And those traits were more frequently passed on to the next generation. This theory that the Japanese were unwittingly exercising artificial selection on the crabs was convincing enough to compel Carl Sagan to include the story in the second episode of his groundbreaking scientific television series, Cosmos: A Personal Voyage. But it's possible that this theory is wrong, and the explanation may be something even more human than refusing to eat something with a human face. This is Loops, a celebration of the interconnectivity of all things in history and science. The original explanation of the faces on the Heike crabs, at least the first explanation grounded in science, came from the famous evolutionary biologist Julian Huxley. He wrote an article about it in the June 30th, 1952 publication of Life magazine, and in that article he stated that the resemblance was far too specific and far too detailed to be accidental. Julian was born into the Huxley family, a British family that saw success in a variety of fields. His grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, was an anthropologist and biologist, sometimes called Darwin's bulldog for his staunch defense of Darwin's theory of evolution. His brother, Aldous Huxley, is the author of Brave New World, and his cousin, Peter Eckersley, was the first chief engineer for the British Broadcasting Company, or BBC. Julian was invited on a lecturing tour in the United States in 1941. When he arrived in New York City in late November, he gave an interview with the press where he stated, "Personally, I hope Japan won't back down, and you'll have to go to war with her next week." The British had already been at war with Germany for over 2 years, and the United States was feeling some pressure to become involved. Little did Huxley know, Japanese forces were already making their way across the Pacific, headed to a spot northwest of Oahu. American support for joining the Second World War skyrocketed after the surprise attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor. 21 of the vessels in the harbor were either damaged or destroyed, 92 naval planes were destroyed, and 31 additional planes were damaged. 2,008 U.S. sailors were killed, plus 218 soldiers and airmen, plus 109 Marines, and even 68 civilians died in the attack. Immediately, Americans began preparing to support their country during wartime. This included Japanese Americans, who made up the majority of the Hawaii Territorial Guard. This guard was mobilized by Hawaii's governor, Joseph B. Poindexter, at 10 a.m., just hours after the attack had begun. In this image of the Hawaii Territorial Guard, or HTG, you can see that the majority of this group are Nisei. A Nisei is a second-generation Japanese immigrant to the Americas. First-generation Japanese Americans are called Issei, third generations are Sansei, each ni-san, Issei Nisei Sansei, and so forth. In the Japanese American community, you often find that Nisei refers to all descendants of first-generation Japanese immigrants. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his Secretary of War didn't really see a difference when he ordered all persons of Japanese ancestry living in certain areas of the West Coast to abandon their homes and relocate to internment camps like this one, near Grenada, Colorado. The Japanese-American war relocation camps were concentration camps by most definition, though some are made uncomfortable by the inherent comparisons to Nazi concentration camps. Some experts suggest that the Nazi camps should be called death camps because the phrase concentration camp does not imply any of the atrocities that were committed by the Nazis. So let's look at Google Dictionary's definition. A place where large numbers of people, especially political prisoners or members of persecuted minorities, fits so far, about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were incarcerated. Are deliberately imprisoned in a relatively small area with inadequate facilities, the living quarters provided at Camp Amachi were cramped, with many families occupying each building. They also had communal showers, and privacy was virtually non-existent. The definition goes on to acknowledge the term's association specifically with Nazi death camps, but the hard edges of the definition are already met. FDR himself would refer to them as concentration camps. In fact, internment camps might be the incorrect term. Internment specifically refers to enemy aliens or non-citizens. Nearly all of those incarcerated were citizens, and about 2/3 were even born in America. And none of this even scratches the surface of the hardship experienced by those Americans. Keep in mind, they were forcibly removed from their actual homes, abandoning their lives. Those who lived at the camp referred to it as Amachi, in honor of the wife of John Wesley Prowers, the namesake of Prowers County. Amachi's father, Cheyenne Peace Chief Ochini, also known as One Eye, was murdered just 36 miles north of Grenada at another terrible event from local history. When gold was discovered in and around the Rocky Mountains in 1858, the Pikes Peak gold rush quickly changed life on the Front Range. The Denver Mint was established in 1862, and waves of immigrants began arriving, but this was already Cheyenne and Arapaho land. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in 1851, described the territory of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people as ranging from modern-day Pueblo north through Colorado Springs, Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins, Cheyenne, Wyoming, and even beyond. Just 10 years later, the new Treaty of Fort Wise shrank that area to less than 1/13 its previous size. Tension and hostility escalated across the Front Range, but here, on November 29, 1864, U.S. Colonel John Chivington ordered an attack on the peaceful camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho people who were massacred, despite having raised the U.S. flag and white flag of surrender. Chivington and his men killed 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people. Well over half of them were women and children, and the bodies of the dead were mutilated, with parts of the corpses taken by Chivington's soldiers as trophies. Not even 2 years prior, the Southern Plains delegation was sent to Washington to improve relations. This photograph is of that delegation at the White House Conservatory, a botanical greenhouse that was once a part of the White House. The group was there to meet with President Lincoln, though he's not pictured. His secretary, J.G. Nicolai, is pictured in the back. Of the 4 Native Americans in the front row, 2 would die in the Sand Creek Massacre, War Bonnet, and Standing in the Water. Lean Bear would die sooner during an encounter with the 1st Colorado Cavalry. Just over a year after this visit to Washington, D.C., where he received a peace medal and papers from President Lincoln, Lean Bear approached the cavalry. Without warning, he was shot and fell to the ground, where he was repeatedly shot by the soldiers as they rode by his body. Like Lean Bear, Black Kettle was a steadfast advocate for peace. And despite being present for the murder of Lean Bear, Black Kettle continued to hope for a peaceful future. That hope for peace would eventually lead to a peace conference in Denver held at Fort Weld. And if you walk down Vallejo Street up to the point where you run up against the 8th Avenue, you'll find this stone monument, erected in 1934, which marks where the southwestern corner of Fort Weld once was. This photo, taken at the conference at Fort Weld, was just 2 months before the massacre. You can see Black Kettle, third from the left in the middle row, and to his right is Amachi's father, Ochini, who was murdered during the massacre. This conference was meant to establish the guidelines for peace, with both Chivington and Colorado Territorial Governor John Evans present, though neither of them are in this photo. The peace chiefs were promised by Evans and Chivington that no harm would come to anyone who surrendered, a promise that was obviously not kept. Not all of the white Coloradoans involved were supportive of the attack, or even tolerated it in silence. For example, take the 2 men in the front of this photo. On the left is Edward Wynkoop, one of the founders of Denver. Prior to this meeting, Wynkoop harbored fierce hatred of Native Americans, writing in a letter to Colonel Chivington, At all events, it is my intention to kill all Indians I may come across until I receive orders to the contrary from headquarters. A few weeks before the conference at Fort Weld, Ochinni delivered a letter to Wynkoop offering to release some white captives if Wynkoop agreed to send a peace delegation. Surprised and impressed by the offer, Wynkoop obliged, bringing 130 cavalrymen with him to the Cheyenne and Arapaho camp at the Smoky Hill River. When Wynkoop informed the chiefs that he didn't have the authority to discuss peace with them, many of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people became angry, accusing Wynkoop of dealing in bad faith. It was an impassioned plea by Ochinni and a speech by Black Kettle that brought the situation down from violent escalation and back to peace talks. Wynkoop, Black Kettle, and Ochinni agreed to travel together to Fort Weld for the conference. And a day after making this agreement, Black Kettle delivered the 3 white children to Wynkoop. After that experience and seeing their commitment to peace, Wynkoop's attitude towards the Cheyenne and Arapaho people had drastically changed, and he was an advocate of theirs thereafter. 2 days after Wynkoop was ordered to leave Fort Lyon and report back to headquarters, Chivington ordered the attack on the peaceful encampment. When Wynkoop learned of this, he fought for and received the authority to return to Fort Lyon and investigate Chivington's actions. The other man in the front of this photo is Silas Soule, who was present at the Sand Creek Massacre but refused to follow Chivington's orders. He wasn't alone in this refusal. Lieutenant Kramer and his men refused to participate as well, but Soule was the only one who would end up dying for this cause. After testifying against Chivington, he was shot in Denver while on duty, and despite the fact that his murderers were known, they were never brought to justice. In 2018, a Denver elementary school teacher applied to the U.S. Board of Geographic Names to change the name of Mount Evans, Colorado's 14th tallest peak and the closest 14er to Denver. The mountain was originally named Mount Rosalie, but was renamed in 1895 in honor of Governor John Evans. While there is no direct evidence of John Evans participating in the planning of or having prior knowledge of the Sand Creek Massacre, it's undeniable that his handling of Indian affairs fostered an environment where the massacre was possible, and his handling of the situation afterwards was reprehensible. He defended and rationalized the attack, which on its own speaks to his moral bankruptcy. President Johnson requested Evans to resign over the incident, and Evans did so on August 1, 1865, less than a year after the massacre. One of the earliest proposals for a replacement name for the mountain was Mount Soule, after Silas Soule. As of the publishing of this video, the top candidate name replacement is Mount Blue Sky. In the proposal, the name is said to reflect the Arapaho people, who are also known as the Blue Sky people, and the Cheyenne, who have a ceremony of renewal of life that's called Blue Sky. If approved at the federal level, this name will officially change. The Mount Evans Scenic Byway allows visitors to drive all the way to the summit in the summer months, and ekes out Pikes Peak Highway as the highest paved road in North America. Finished in 1930, the last 600 feet needing to be built by hand, the byway achieves its primary goal of allowing Denverites to explore the mountains with their automobiles. Almost immediately, the byway was put to scientific use by this man, Arthur Compton. He was investigating cosmic rays, which were recently discovered and observed to occur at higher frequencies at higher altitudes. With the byway, Mount Evans was the highest altitude one could get to by car, and it was also the closest to Denver, which led to the site becoming a place of cosmic ray study, with the University of Denver building an A-frame building at the summit. As cosmic rays bombard the atmosphere, they generate a rain of subatomic particles that fall from the sky down to the surface of the Earth. Compton urged Italian physicist Bruno Rossi to visit Mount Evans to conduct experiments concerning the lifetime of mesotrons, one of these particles that are generated by cosmic rays. In 1939, Rossi showed in his experiment that the difference in mesotron decay between the summit of Mount Evans and at Echo Lake, a lake that's at the base of the mountain, was greater than the decay measured in a graphite screen of density equal to that same distance of air. He compared the air to the graphite screen to rule out any differences in what he described as the stopping power of air and carbon, which led him conclude that the mesotrons were disintegrating on their own while moving through the air. With a measurement of the relative number of mesotrons between the two altitudes, he was able to calculate their average lifespan, which was 2 × 10⁻⁶ seconds, or 2 microseconds. What Rossi called mesotrons would later be better understood and renamed muons. By the end of 1943, in collaboration with Norris Nearison, Rossi understood the at-rest average lifetime of muons to be 2.15 plus or minus 0.07 microseconds. But to a non-physicist, this may have seemed to be in disagreement with the measurements Rossi observed at Mount Evans. If he had simply calculated the known distance traveled by the muons divided by their speed, his original conclusion of 2 microseconds would have instead been significantly longer, at least 10 times longer. Rossi knew in his original experiments that he would need to account for something predicted by Einstein that would affect his measurements: time dilation. Without this understanding of time dilation, the muons generated at the upper edge of the atmosphere would only be expected to travel on average about half a kilometer before they decayed. Instead, many make it all the way down to the surface of the Earth and beyond. Einstein's theory of special relativity explains that objects moving at faster velocities relative to a reference point will experience time more slowly than the reference point does. Said differently, for fast-moving objects like the muons generated by cosmic rays, time dilates. To us on the reference frame of the surface of the Earth, muons generated by cosmic rays appear to last much longer than their true average lifespan of 2.2 microseconds. But to them, and anything moving at the same speed and direction as them, they last the normal lifespan that we measure when they're generated experimentally on the surface of the Earth at rest. Einstein's theory of special relativity is older and simpler than his theory of general relativity, which expands his explanations beyond constant velocities in unchanging directions. General relativity explains that gravitational time dilation produces similar stretching of time, but instead of differing velocities, it's observed in differing distances from gravitating masses. Erwin Shapiro proposed testing this part of general relativity in 1964 by bouncing radar pulses off of Venus and Mercury and listening for the echoes. If the path of the radar pulses travels nearer to the Sun, there should be a gravitational time dilation for those pulses, depending on how close to the Sun the pulse would need to travel. These experiments were carried out, and in 1968 Shapiro published the successful results, demonstrating gravitational time dilation. Shapiro would go on to make similar measurements and increase the accuracy of his findings. However, the topology of the planets he was using caused distortion in the results. Luckily for Shapiro, an opportunity to make measurements that would increase his accuracy greatly would arrive less than a decade later. This experiment would not rely on the topology of a planet for an echo and would allow him to make measurements from a fixed point on the surface of Mars instead. Well, 2 points actually. When most people hear Voyager in association with NASA, they think of the Voyager space probes, launched in late 1977 and still operating today. But the Voyager program's name was recycled from the Voyager Mars program, a plan to land 2 landers on Mars, with 2 orbiters as well. The Voyager Mars program had been deprioritized by the manned Apollo missions to the moon, which led to the program being defunded by Congress. While the name got recycled into the Voyager space probes, the planning and development itself was recycled into the Viking program. This program was still 2 landers and 2 orbiters for Mars, but with some significant compromises due to those cuts in funding. These Mars landers, Viking 1 and Viking 2, would be the opportunity that Shapiro was hoping for. He used periodic signals sent from Mars to Earth during the time when Mars passed behind the Sun from Earth's perspective, with the maximum conjunction occurring on Thanksgiving Day in 1976. The results were successful in increasing the accuracy of these measurements, an important step towards the path of ruling out competing theories of gravitation. The Viking program wasn't launched with this specific experiment in mind, of course. The program was mostly concerned with getting better pictures of the Martian surface and searching for evidence of life. We'll call those Objective 1 and Objective 2. And boy, did they nail it on Objective 1. Before the Viking mission's images, there was Mariner 4, Mariner 6, Mariner 7, including this photo showing Phobos. It's the dot on the left. The one on the right is a part of a grid of registration marks, which are helpful to make measurements. Mariner 7 also took this color photo of Mars using a composite of color-filtered photos. And Mariner 9. Then Viking sent back its photos. We could now see some pretty incredible details on the surface of the planet, a lot more detail than we had ever seen before. Objective 2 was searching for evidence of life, and while this job was left to the Viking landers, the Viking 1 orbiter did spot this surprising feature on the surface. The images you might have seen of the Cydonia face on Mars probably look more like this one, which is the spookiest. First off, the contrast is much greater, and these black speckles caused by bit errors also add to the eeriness of this discovery. You can distinctly see 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, and even a lower lip. How did a human face end up on Mars? Before we answer that, let's review. Heikegani crabs show artificially selected samurai scowls, a theory first published by Julian Huxley, who accidentally predicted the United States entering World War II, weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, an event which fostered suspicion of Japanese Americans, many of whom were sent to war relocation camps, like the Grenada relocation camp, informally called Camp Amachi by residents that were imprisoned there, in honor of the Cheyenne woman Amachi Prowers, whose father was murdered at the Sand Creek Massacre, a stain on American history that today is resulting in the renaming of Mount Evans, where the average lifespan of the muon was first observed, while also demonstrating special relativity's time dilation, a sibling theory to general relativity's gravitational time dilation, demonstrated by experiments conducting using the Viking probes, which also took this snapshot of a human face on Mars. Of course, there isn't a human face on Mars at all, or even a structure of some sort that's meant to resemble a face. Here's a photo of the same area taken by the same Viking 1 orbiter just a few orbits later. Mars had rotated a bit, and the shadows have changed. It still looks like a face to many, but not nearly as much as the first photo. Fast forward a few decades, and we have the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter's images of the same feature. Maybe there's a face still recognizable in there, but it's definitely not as clear as the original made it seem, nor does it appear to be anything other than a geological feature. This effect is known as pareidolia, which is a human tendency to perceive familiarity in unclear or random stimuli. This effect is often seen as the visual recognition of faces in places where they aren't, but it doesn't have to be faces, and it doesn't even have to be visual in nature at all to count as pareidolia. Marine biologist Joel Martin, an expert on crustaceans, argues that Huxley's explanation of the crab's faces emerging from evolutionary pressures is interesting, but not true. He points out that the grooves on the back of Heikegani occur in nearly all members of Dorippidae, the family of species that Heikegani belong to. And what's more, Dorippidae with faces are found distributed in far-off waters, even in other Asian countries, where their faces are also recognized. But Martin points out that there's even stronger evidence here. Japanese fishermen throw all Heikegani back, regardless of how strong the resemblance of the face on the carapace is. Julian Huxley may have experienced a sort of double whammy here. Not only is the Heikegani phenomenon better explained by pareidolia, seeing faces where there isn't one, but Huxley himself, an evolutionary biologist, likely saw a pattern of evolution where there wasn't one. Thank you for watching. These are fun to make, but they're especially fun to research. I usually learn a whole lot making these videos, so if you'd like to check out my sources and learn more, I always either have the sources at the end of the video or down in the description below. Till next time. Joseph P. Poindexter. Joseph P. Poindexter.